Hey everyone, and welcome to Brent's Notepad, where ideas become insight. I'm Brent Shelton, inviting you to think deeper, lead better, and live more intentionally. In each episode, I dive into big questions and meaningful ideas drawn from books, research, and real life. In today's episode, we're unpacking Chapter 10 of Exploring Leadership, the second edition, written by Richard Bolden, Jonathan Gosling, and Beverly Hawkins. In this chapter, the authors bring their book to an end by wrapping up their discussion on what they describe as the cross-cutting and emerging perspectives of leadership. In doing so, they investigate the evolution of responsible leadership, they dive into the spiritual side, some substitutions to leadership practices, and what they project as the future of leadership studies. So let's dive in. The authors begin this chapter by reminding us that leadership is not a fixed destination. It's an ongoing practice that we never fully arrive at. It's messy, complicated, full of contradictions, and it's happening all around us, whether we realize it or not. So the real question is not who is a perfect leader, but rather what kind of leadership do we need now, and how do we actually practice it? Well, to address this question, the author suggests that we need to be aware that most of us live in a world that has been shaped by neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a philosophy centered on capitalism, competition, and the idea that an organization's only social responsibility is to increase profits. While the authors have shown us in previous chapters why this is a dangerous metric to define success, the reality is that this mindset drives many organizations, which causes them to prioritize narrow-minded and short-term goals, while neglecting employee well-being and environmental impacts, leading to depleted resources and fractured communities. Critics of neoliberalism suggest, and rightfully so, that organizations and leaders of organizations should be held accountable for more than just the profit they create. They should be held accountable for how their decisions and their actions impact social and natural environments. These critiques call for a more holistic way to assess organizations and their leaders, by viewing their financial performance as well as their social and environmental impacts, through what Elkington 1998 famously called the triple bottom line. This push for broader accountability gave rise to what is called the Corporate Social Responsibility Model, or CSR for short. The Corporate Social Responsibility Model, often seen as the first step towards more responsible leadership practices, says that profits come first, and then we can give a portion back through philanthropy, donations, or sustainability projects. And while the CSR model is well-intentioned, it still lives in the margins of business as usual. In other words, it's treating the broader responsibilities, such as social and environmental impacts, as something that's optional, something added on once success has already been measured by the profits. Critiques of the CSR model have since led to the interactive revised stakeholder model that takes that thinking just a little further. Instead of treating responsibility as an afterthought, this model weaves it into the daily fabric of an organization. It recognizes that all stakeholders, such as employees, customers, communities, the environment, and investors all matter, and that leadership practices should find a balance between these needs in an ongoing way. In this view, success isn't only financial returns. It's about creating long-term value for all stakeholders. And this is where the authors lead us to the practice of responsible leadership. According to Mack and Pless, 2006, responsible leadership is relational and ethical, occurring as a social process between leaders and followers, both of whom have an equal stake in the purpose and vision of an organization. In other words, responsible leadership goes beyond isolated programs or even structural models. It's about leaders themselves taking responsibility for the impact of their decisions. It requires seeing leadership as stewardship, not just management, and understanding that the choices leaders make ripple outward into society, communities, and future generations. Responsible leadership asks us to expand our definition of success, to hold ourselves accountable to ethical standards, and to practice leadership that sustains people and our planet, not just the bottom line. It involves leaders who engage broadly with all stakeholders, employees, customers, communities, future generations, and the natural world alike. It's about stewardship, ethics, and long-term thinking. Overall, the notion of responsible leadership practices calls leaders to question, what are we really leading for? Sure, profits for your organization can mean more profit for your back pocket, but as the old saw goes, you can't take it with you when you go, or You never see a U-Haul behind a hearse. And with this in mind, the authors dive a little deeper into the eschatological aspect of leadership, thinking about ultimate meanings in one's destiny. Here, the authors introduce us to the religious or spiritual side of leadership, which includes positive leadership practices such as positive deviance, which are just abnormal behaviors that are actually beneficial. It's praising people's strengths rather than criticizing their weaknesses, incorporating mindfulness practices, and overall just concentrating on the facilitation of goodness and virtue, both organizationally and individually. Pivotal scholarship in the spiritual domain of leadership includes the work of Fry 2003, Fry and Slocum 2008, and Fry and Cohen 2009. Through their work, the authors argue that leadership, in the spiritual sense, requires leaders to pay attention to their followers' personal lives, their sense of calling, and the construction of a community which is built on altruistic love. In fact, some scholars who have dove into the spiritual domain of leadership, such as Grint 2010, suggest that leadership itself is inherently a sacred process, which is much different from managerial or administrative practices. Okay, at this point, the authors have brought us to perhaps the highest level of leadership practices, where leaders and leadership practices are divine or sacred. But what happens when even these divine leadership practices don't quite work? Well, to address this question, the authors take us down the trail of leadership substitutes, such as partnerships and even anarchy. And what's interesting, being that this is a book about leadership, is that the author suggests that sometimes organizing collective action through leadership substitutes, such as partnerships or anarchy, may be the appropriate choice. First, considering partnerships as a substitute for leadership. Partnerships are essentially relationships that divide responsibilities amongst the members in the partnership, which are often based on availability, resources, and expertise, where there are no formal roles of authority. Additionally, partnerships rely on mutual collaboration and genuine appreciation for what each partner brings to the table. Ultimately, the authors suggest that partnerships can be a viable option for mobilizing collective action when the leader-follower dynamics break down. Now, considering anarchy, while this is often understood as the absence or the collapse of social order, the authors suggest that it may be an effective way of organizing collective action. At its root, anarchy simply means without a ruler, or without having someone in power. Therefore, anarchy in terms of a leadership substitute is the idea that members within a community can voluntarily self-organize, allowing for increased emphasis on equality of voice and representation within the collective action. Overall, substitutes for leadership really underscore the contextual relevance of each and every situation and encourage the idea of what Western 2014 calls autonomous leadership, which encourages the agency of individuals, and it avoids the constraint which leaders and those who in authority typically bring. All right, from here, the authors shift into discussing the way in which language shapes leadership. Now, this is different from the approach to leadership that suggests it can be viewed as a narrative practice, where leaders can shape a story and mobilize collective action. Here, the authors are talking about actual languages. For example, the term leadership in English, Spanish, German, Arabic, Russian, French, Italian, Chinese, they all carry cultural baggage and societal assumptions, somewhat in the same way that our perceptions of gender impact our ideas of leadership as well. The authors illustrate the impacts of language through the idea of performativity. Performativity is the idea that language and words used in certain situations can carry different meanings. For example, in a normal American Western marriage ceremony, when somebody says, "I do," it carries a legal or spiritual consequence behind it, whereas saying "I do" in other contexts will mean something completely different. Overall, understanding the impacts of language just further illustrates the complexity of leadership and all that it entails. Overall, understanding that language itself impacts leadership is just another reason why leadership can be so complex. And from here, the authors bring our book to a close by suggesting future directions and kind of do their own little reflection on leadership and leadership studies. First, they remind us that leadership as a concept is similar to the ideas of love and beauty and even humor. It's extremely subjective and culturally and socially bound. Here, they highlight the work of Kelly 2014, who suggests that leadership investigations is a lot like using a ruler to measure the face of God. Additionally, the authors remind us that there is no single theory or practice that can fully encapsulate all that leadership entails. Therefore, leadership studies and practices are like a big leadership puzzle. They have many interlocking pieces, and sometimes we put the wrong piece in the wrong place. Which is why it's helpful to remember that traditional quantitative and positivist approaches to leadership studies can be helpful. It's easy for them to miss the mark, fully illustrating the lived experiences and the complexities of leadership, which really call for the need of qualitative and constructivist approaches to leadership studies. Furthermore, the author suggests that leadership is hermeneutic. It involves the exchange of meanings and co-creating shared understandings, which is why they highlight the need for coaching and mentoring for young leaders who aspire to do the work. The only prerequisite here is that they have to be willing to do the work, to experiment, to learn through the process of trial and error, because at the end of the day, for the sake of future generations, this is something we're all called to do. All right, those are the key components of Chapter 10. Let's take some time and reflect. First, responsible leadership is about stewardship, not just authority. Leadership isn't simply about managing tasks, hitting targets, or chasing profits. It's about understanding that every choice ripples outwards and taking ownership of those effects. For me, this is a reminder that being a leader means constantly asking myself, am I contributing to something that lasts and is truly beneficial to others? Or even, am I contributing to something bigger than myself? Second, leadership is deeply connected to human values and purpose. And the spiritual side of leadership really stuck out to me. Leadership is profoundly human and even a sacred practice. Paying attention to people's sense of calling, fostering a sense of community, and focusing on goodness and virtue shifts the lens from mere outcomes to meaning. It reminds me that leading well means nurturing both the organization and the people within it, encouraging growth, well-being, and ethical engagement along the way. Leadership at its best is about inspiring purpose and facilitating positive change that extends beyond the workplace. And third, the author's discussion on substitutes for leadership, this really stuck out to me because it reminds me that leadership isn't the only option. Sometimes, stepping back, sharing responsibility, or creating structures that allow for optimistic self-organization is just the best practice. Finally, thinking about the future of leadership and leadership studies, the authors remind us that leadership is subjective, culturally bound, and constantly evolving. There's no single formula or approach that can work in every situation. For me, the takeaway is this. Leadership isn't about arriving at a destination. It's about engaging with the process, thoughtfully, ethically, and creatively, always keeping in mind the impact that our actions will have for those to come. So, as we think about leadership in our own lives, maybe the real question isn't, am I a perfect leader, but rather, am I leading responsibly, ethically, with a purpose in a way that contributes to something larger than myself? That's it for today's episode. Thanks for listening to Brent's Notepad, where ideas become insight. Until next time, lead better, think deeper, and live more intentionally.